The wind howled through the cracks of the small wooden church in Iron Ridge, Wyoming, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the coming winter. It was the chill of a man about to lose his soul to save his family. Caleb Thorne, a rugged rancher who had survived blizzards, wolves, and the heartbreak of burying a wife, now stood trembling before a piece of paper. Standing over him was Silas Blackwood, the wealthiest and cruelest land baron in the territory, wearing a smile that looked like a jagged scar. The ultimatum was brutal and simple. Sign the marriage certificate. Caleb or your 7-year-old daughter goes to the orphanage by sunset, and your ranch burns by dawn. But the cruelty wasn't just the debt, it was the bride. Walking through the church doors wasn't a blushing maiden, but Eleanor Vance, a woman banished from the sophisticated East, cast out by her own father like unwanted luggage. She was educated, sharp, and beautiful, but she carried a secret that made her worthless in the eyes of 1880s society. She was barren. The town gossips whispered that this was a punishment for both of them. A broken man forced to marry a broken woman. They expected misery. They expected the ranch to fail. But what Eleanor did next didn't just shock the town of Iron Ridge. It brought the most powerful man in the territory to his knees. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we uncover how this unlikely outcast saved a family on the brink of destruction, I have a small favor to ask. If you love tales of the Wild West, redemption and justice served cold, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us reach a larger audience and keep these stories alive. Also, I'd love to know who is sitting around our campfire today. Drop a comment below, telling me which part of the world you're watching from. Now let's head back to 1885 and witness a marriage that started as a curse, but became a legend. The wooden floorboards of the small chapel in Iron Ridge groaned under the weight of silence, so heavy it felt like it could crush a man's chest. It was August, but inside those walls the air was cold enough to freeze breath. Caleb Thorne stood at the altar, his hat clutched in hands that were calloused from barbed wire and rope, hands that were currently shaking with a rage he could barely contain. At 32, Caleb looked 10 years older. The harsh Wyoming wind had carved deep lines into his face, but it was the grief of the last 8 months that had truly aged him. He had buried his wife, Sarah, when the fever took her, and now he was standing here to sign away the last shred of his dignity to save what was left. Standing just to his right was Silas Blackwood, the man who owned the bank, half the town, and currently the deed to Caleb's soul. Blackwood's suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to Caleb's dusted ranch clothes. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone. "The pen is right there, Thorne. Sign it. Or by noon tomorrow, the sheriff takes your little girl, Lily, to the orphanage in Cheyenne, and I put your land up for auction." Judge Holloway, a man whose pockets were lined with Blackwood's gold, looked on with feigned solemnity. "The law is clear, son," the judge mumbled, avoiding Caleb's eyes. "A man alone can't raise a young girl on the frontier. It's neglect. You need a wife." The heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open, admitting a slice of blinding sunlight before closing again. The woman who walked down the aisle didn't look like a bride. She looked like a prisoner marching to the gallows, though she walked with a spine so straight it looked painful. Eleanor Vance was tall and striking, with auburn hair pinned back so severely it pulled at her skin, and eyes the color of moss that held absolutely no light. She was 28 years old, an age considered an old maid back east in Philadelphia. She wore a simple gray traveling dress that whispered against the floorboards, carrying herself with a rigid grace that screamed of high society. Yet here she was, in a dusty cattle town, about to marry a stranger. She had been discarded. That was the only word for it. Her father, the esteemed Dr. Archibald Vance, had sent her west like a parcel of unwanted goods. She had been engaged 3 times in Philadelphia, and 3 times the engagements were broken when the truth came out. Eleanor was barren. In the polite society of the East, a woman who couldn't produce an heir was worse than useless. She was a scandal. Blackwood, an old acquaintance of her father, had arranged this transaction. Her substantial dowry would pay off Caleb's crippling debt, and Caleb's name would give Eleanor a place to hide her shame. "Do you come of your own free will?" the nervous young pastor asked, sweat beading on his forehead. "I do," Eleanor lied. Her voice was steady, monotone, devoid of any emotion. "And you, Caleb?" Caleb looked over his shoulder to the front pew. Little Lily, only 6 years old, sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her blonde braids messy, staring at him with eyes full of betrayal. She looked so much like her mother that it physically hurt him. He was doing this for her, only for her. "I do," Caleb gritted out. He shoved a simple silver band onto Eleanor's finger. His hand brushed hers, and he was startled by how cold her skin was, like marble left out in the snow. They didn't kiss. They simply nodded. Two strangers bound by a contract written in ink and desperation. "Done," Blackwood announced, snapping the ledger shut with a satisfied smirk. "First payment on the remaining interest is due in 6 months, Thorne. Don't disappoint me." As they walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, the reality of the situation crashed down on them. Lily refused to even look at Eleanor. When Caleb tried to help his daughter into the back of the wagon, she recoiled. "She's not Mama," Lily screamed, her voice cracking with a sob that tore through the town square. "You promised no one would replace Mama." "Lily, please," Caleb pleaded. But the girl scrambled into the wagon bed and curled into a ball, hiding her face. The ride to the ranch, which Caleb called the Jagged Rock, was 15 miles of suffocating silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels. Eleanor sat on the bench beside him, staring straight ahead at the peaks of the Teton Range rising in the distance. She didn't complain about the dust or the heat, which surprised Caleb. Most city women would be fainting by now. "Why?" Caleb finally asked, his voice rough from disuse. He kept his eyes on the road. "I know why I'm here." Blackwood had a gun to my head. "But you're educated. You come from money. Does this arrangement truly benefit you?" Eleanor turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw the steel behind the emptiness in her eyes. "Benefit, Mr. Thorne?" "That depends on how you define it. I avoid the humiliation of living in my father's house as a failure. I gain a roof over my head where no one knows the whispers of Philadelphia society. Whether that is a benefit or just a different kind of prison remains to be seen." Her brutal honesty stunned him. She wasn't looking for pity. She was stating facts. "Then we understand each other," Caleb muttered. "I believe we do." They crested the final ridge, and the ranch came into view. It was a sturdy, log-timbered house nestled in a valley that looked like God had carved it out with his own thumb. It was beautiful but neglected. Fences were leaning, and the garden Sarah had loved was overrun with weeds. Waiting on the porch was Martha, the housekeeper who had been with Caleb since he and Sarah first built the place. Martha was a stout woman, with arms like tree trunks and a heart that belonged entirely to the ghost of Sarah Thorne. She crossed her arms as the wagon pulled up, her eyes narrowing at the woman in the gray dress. "Mr. Thorne." Martha nodded stiffly, then turned her gaze to Eleanor. "Mrs. Thorne." Eleanor flinched at the title, a crack in her armor, but she recovered instantly. "Please just call me Eleanor. We'll be working together, I assume." "As you say," Martha replied, her tone making it clear that Eleanor was an intruder in this shrine to the past. "I've put your trunk in the spare room at the end of the hall." "The guest room?" Eleanor nodded, accepting the insult without a word. That night, dinner was a quiet catastrophe. Lily refused to come downstairs. Caleb sat at the head of the long table, and Eleanor sat at the far end. Sarah's empty chair sitting between them like a barrier of invisible fire. The only sound was the scraping of forks on tin plates. Finally, Eleanor set her fork down. "We should establish rules, Mr. Thorne, to survive this." Caleb looked up, weary. "Go on." "Separate rooms," Eleanor stated firmly. "We present a united front in town to keep the bankers away, but in this house, we need not pretend to have an affection that doesn't exist. I will manage the household accounts. I'm quite good with numbers, and you run the land. And as for Lily..." She hesitated, her voice softening just a fraction. "I will not force myself on her. A child's grief is a fragile thing. I will be here, consistent and patient. If it takes years, then it takes years." It sounded like a business merger, cold and clinical. But Caleb saw something else, dignity. She was trying to salvage her pride in a situation that had stripped her of everything else. "Agreed," Caleb said. "I'm not looking for a new wife, Eleanor. Just a mother for my girl and a way to keep this land." "Then we are in accord," she said, standing up. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." As Caleb watched her walk down the dark hallway to the spare room, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity. She was brittle, yes, but she wasn't weak. And as the wind began to howl outside, signaling a storm rolling off the mountains, Caleb had no idea that the woman He had just married out of desperation, was about to become the only thing standing between him and total ruin. The first week at the Jagged Rock wasn't a marriage. It was a silent siege. The house, usually filled with the warmth of a home, felt like a cold storage cellar. Eleanor rose before the sun every single morning, determined to master the kitchen under Martha's watchful, judgmental eye. But the frontier wasn't Philadelphia. The wood-burning stove was temperamental. A cast-iron beast that seemed to hate her. She burned the biscuits until they were hard enough to use as ammunition. She scalded the laundry in water that was too hot, blistering her hands that had never known labor harder than turning the pages of a book. Caleb made sure to be gone before she came downstairs, disappearing into the barn or out onto the range. They ate dinner at opposite ends of the long table, the silence stretching between them like a tightrope, while Lily's empty chair sat between them, a constant reminder of the little girl hiding in her room. 3 days in, the vultures circled, or rather, the neighbors. Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Miller, wives from the neighboring homesteads, rode over under the pretense of welcoming the new bride. But Eleanor saw their eyes darting around the kitchen, cataloging every mistake, every smudge of flour on her dress. "Heard you were a teacher back east," Mrs. Higgins sniffed, accepting a cup of tea as if she were doing Eleanor a favor. "In Philadelphia, yes," Eleanor replied politely. "Well, this ain't the city." "Honey," Mrs. Higgins chuckled, exchanging a look with Mrs. Miller. "Out here, a woman needs to know practical things. Birthing calves, preserving meat, shooting a rifle. Not poetry." Eleanor set her teacup down with a delicate clink. "I can shoot," she said softly. "My father taught me." The women laughed openly. "A doctor's daughter who shoots? That's rich." After they left, cackling down the driveway, Eleanor noticed a small shadow in the doorway. It was Lily. The girl looked at her with skepticism. "Can you really shoot?" she asked, her voice small. "Would you like to see?" Eleanor asked. For the first time in months, Lily nodded. They went out to the back fence. Eleanor set up 5 empty tin cans on the rail. She went to the gun cabinet and pulled out Caleb's heavy Colt revolver. It was heavy in her hand, smelling of gun oil and steel. She checked the cylinder with a practiced flick of her wrist, leveled her arm, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Bang, 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 bang. 5 shots. 5 cans flew off the fence, spinning into the dirt. Lily's mouth fell open. That was amazing. She looked up at Eleanor, her gray eyes searching. "Was my mama good at everything?" Eleanor knelt down, ignoring the dust on her dress. "From what I hear, your mama was good at everything that mattered. She was perfect." "She was," Lily whispered. "Then you are lucky," Eleanor said gently. "You had a mother who was perfect. Now you're stuck with one who burns bread but can hit a target at 50 yards. We'll just have to make do." Lily almost smiled. It was a tiny crack in the ice, but it was there. However, the real storm broke 3 weeks into the marriage. It happened in the study, Sarah's old sanctuary. Martha had grudgingly admitted that while Eleanor was a disaster with a skillet, she was a wizard with numbers. Eleanor had taken over the ranch's books. Late one Tuesday, Caleb came in from the range, exhausted and covered in dust. He found Eleanor surrounded by stacks of paper, her face pale with fury. "What are you doing?" he asked, rubbing his neck. "Discovering that you are being robbed," she stated flatly. She shoved a document toward him. It was the loan agreement from Silas Blackwood. "Look at this. The contract is dated March 20th, but you signed it on the 15th. And look here, he's been charging you interest from March 1st, 2 weeks before you ever received a penny." Caleb squinted at the paper. "That snake, but we can't fight it. The terms are signed." "The terms are illegal, Caleb," Eleanor insisted, her voice rising. "There are penalty clauses here designed to ensure you fail. He never intended for you to pay this off. He intends to steal your land. And who is going to believe us, you?" Caleb snapped, his pride stinging. "You're not a lawyer, Eleanor. You're a—" He stopped, but the word hung in the air. "Woman." Eleanor stood up, drawing herself to her full height. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, I am a woman. A woman who assisted her father with legal contracts when patients couldn't pay. A woman who read every law text in his library while the men smoked cigars and dismissed her. I can see what you can't. Blackwood is a thief, and you are his victim. Now you can let your pride throw us off this land, or you can let me help you fight." She walked out, leaving him staring at the ledger, realizing for the first time that the woman in the gray dress was sharper than any knife he owned. That night, the house was awoken by a scream. It was Lily. Caleb was out checking the horses, so Eleanor ran down the hall, her heart hammering. She burst into Lily's room to find the child tangled in the sheets, sobbing for her mother. "Lily, sweetheart, wake up. You're safe," Eleanor cooed, sitting on the edge of the bed. Lily's eyes flew open, wild with terror. "Where's Papa?" "He'll be back soon. Can I stay until he comes?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. Eleanor stroked the girl's hair, her touch light. "Want to tell me about the dream?" "Mama was trying to come home," Lily sobbed. "But she couldn't find us because everything is different. She promised she'd never leave." "She didn't want to leave, Lily," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Sometimes our bodies fail us, even when our hearts don't." Lily looked at her, wiping her nose. "Are you sad too?" "Sometimes." "Because you can't have babies?" The air left Eleanor's lungs. The cruelty of small-town gossip had reached even a 6-year-old. "How did you know?" "I heard Mrs. Higgins tell Mrs. Miller. She said that's why Papa had to marry you, because you can't replace Mama anyway." It felt like a physical blow. Eleanor took a steadying breath. "That is true. I cannot have children, but that doesn't mean I can't love them. And it doesn't mean I want to replace your Mama. She was your first mother, and she always will be. I'm just here, if you need me." Lily was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached out and took Eleanor's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around Eleanor's cold ones, squeezing tight. They sat like that until Caleb returned an hour later. He stopped in the doorway, stunned. He saw his daughter asleep, curled against Eleanor's side, and Eleanor asleep with her arm protectively over the child. Something in Caleb's chest, something that had been frozen since the funeral, cracked. The next morning, the kitchen felt different. The silence wasn't as heavy. Eleanor poured Caleb coffee as he sat down. "I want to go to Cheyenne," she said, not asking for permission. "There's a lawyer there, Samuel Fletcher. He has a reputation for being honest. We need to show him these documents." "It's a 2-day ride," Caleb said, watching her over the rim of his cup. "Then we should leave soon." "I'm going," Caleb said. "With or without you, Mr. Thorne," she interrupted. "I meant," Caleb corrected, a faint smile touching his lips, "that it would be easier with me." "We leave tomorrow." Eleanor nodded. "Good. And Mr. Thorne? Regarding last night, you were going to say, I'm not a lawyer because I'm a woman. But I think what you really meant is that I'm not someone you can dismiss anymore." She turned back to the stove. Caleb watched her, the morning light catching the determined set of her jaw. He realized then that Blackwood had made a fatal mistake. He thought he had burdened Caleb with a weak, broken spinster. Instead, he had armed him with a warrior. The ride to Cheyenne was long, the Wyoming plains stretching out like a tawny ocean of grass under a hard blue sky. For the first few hours, the only sound was the creak of leather saddles and the wind, hissing through the sagebrush. But miles have a way of wearing down walls, and by the time they stopped to water the horses at a crooked creek, the silence between Caleb and Eleanor had shifted. It wasn't hostile anymore. It was companionable. As they sat under the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing hardtack and dried beef, Eleanor broke the quiet. "Tell me about this lawyer, Samuel Fletcher. Why do you trust him?" Caleb looked out toward the horizon, his eyes softening. "Sam and I served together in the war. He saved my life at Chancellorsville. Pulled me onto his horse after I took a bullet to the leg. Rode through enemy fire to get me out." Caleb chuckled, a rusty sound. "He's honorable. Sometimes stupidly so. Reminds me of someone else I'm starting to know." Eleanor glanced up, a flicker of surprise in her green eyes. "Was that respect, Mr. Thorne? Almost a compliment?" "Don't let it go to your head, Mrs. Thorne," he replied, tipping his hat. But the use of her married name didn't sting this time. It felt solid. They arrived in Cheyenne as the sun was beginning to dip, painting the town in shades of dusty gold and long shadows. The town was rougher than Iron Ridge, bustling with miners, cattlemen, and drifters. Eleanor noticed how Caleb subtly positioned his horse between her and the rowdy crowds, a silent shield of protection she had never experienced before. Samuel Fletcher's office was a small, book-lined room above the bank, smelling of stale tobacco and old paper. Sam was a man with ink-stained fingers and a sharp smile. He greeted Caleb with a bear hug and turned his charm on Eleanor. "So you're the woman who tamed the mountain man," Sam teased. "I haven't tamed anything, Mr. Fletcher," Eleanor replied, smoothing her skirts. "I've simply pointed out that he is being swindled." Sam laughed, delighted, and they got to work. For hours they pored over the documents. As Sam reviewed Eleanor's notes, his expression darkened. Blackwood has been playing this game for years, but he's gotten arrogant. This is the first time I've seen him be this sloppy. He pointed to the clauses Eleanor had circled. These discrepancies could invalidate the entire contract. But to prove it in court, we need more than paper. We need people. People? Caleb asked. Witnesses, Sam said grimly. Folks Blackwood has cheated before. We need 10, maybe 15 testimonies to show a pattern of fraud. If we can get those, we can bury him. That could take weeks, Caleb said, rubbing his temple. Then you better start soon, Sam warned. Because once Blackwood knows we're coming for him, this is going to get ugly. By the time they left the office, night had fallen. They walked to the only hotel in town, exhausted, only to find the clerk shaking his head. Sorry, folks. Cattlemen's convention in town. The whole place is booked solid. I got one small room left, one bed. Eleanor and Caleb stood in the doorway of the tiny room, staring at the single iron bed frame. I'll sleep in the chair, Caleb said immediately. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor sighed, unpinning her hat. You're too tall and you have a bad leg. We are both adults. We can share a bed without... She trailed off, a rare blush coloring her cheeks. They lay in the darkness, stiff as boards, a foot of space between them feeling like a canyon. Neither could sleep. The sounds of the saloon below drifted up through the floorboards. Eleanor? Caleb's voice was a low rumble in the dark. Yes? Why didn't you fight harder? Back east, when your father sent you away? The silence stretched so long he thought she wouldn't answer. I did fight, she whispered. I told my father about the rumors my cousin, Charles, was spreading when I refused to be his mistress. But my father, he couldn't bear the scandal. He valued his reputation more than his daughter. I was destroying his life's work just by existing. She turned her head on the pillow, a tear slipping into her hair. If I had been able to have children, if I had been normal, none of this would have happened. You are normal, Eleanor, Caleb said firmly. You're just different, and different isn't failure. The world is wrong if it sees it that way. You really believe that? I'm starting to. In the moonlight, something shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a profound recognition. Two outcasts finding steady ground. Thank you, Caleb, she whispered, for trusting me, for not giving up on us. They fell asleep facing each other, closer than they had been since the day they met. They returned to the Jagged Rock 3 days later, armed with a plan to split up and gather testimonies from the surrounding territories. But Silas Blackwood had not been idle. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, Caleb reined his horse in hard. No, he breathed. Thick black smoke was spiraling up from the ranch. Lily! Caleb shouted, spurring his horse into a gallop. Eleanor was right on his heels, her heart in her throat. They thundered into the yard. The barn was scorched, one wall blackened and smoldering, but the fire was out. Standing on the porch, covered in soot but looking fierce as a badger, was Martha. Behind her, clutching a doll, was Lily, terrified but unharmed. Caleb vaulted off his horse before it stopped moving, scooping Lily into his arms. What happened? He demanded, checking her for burns. Tom, the ranch foreman, walked over, wiping ash from his face. Blackwood's men came. Said they were inspecting the property. Tried to force their way into the house. And? Caleb barked. And Mrs. Thorne didn't take kindly to it, Martha said, stepping forward. Caleb turned, confused. What? Not you, sir, Martha said, pointing a thumb at Eleanor, who was sliding off her horse. Her. Before you left for Cheyenne, she showed me where the scattergun was kept. But it wasn't me who used it today. It was... Well, she ain't here right now. Caleb looked around. He had misread the scene. The smoke wasn't fresh, it was hours old. They had arrived in the aftermath. But he was confused. I don't understand, Caleb said. It happened yesterday, Tom clarified. While you were gone. We got the fire out, but only because they ran off. Why did they run? Eleanor asked, stepping up to the porch. Because someone started shooting from the upper window, Tom grinned, looking at Martha. Wasn't me, Martha said. It was the little miss. They all turned to Lily. The 6-year-old looked up at Eleanor. I did what you showed me, she whispered. With the cans. I was scared, but I remembered how you stood. Eleanor froze. She hadn't been there to defend the ranch this time, but her lesson had saved it. She dropped to her knees and pulled Lily into a hug, burying her face in the girl's smoky hair. But the danger wasn't over. That night, after the animals were secured, Caleb paced the kitchen. He escalated. This isn't about debt anymore. It's about power. We need those testimonies, Eleanor said, wiping soot from the table. It's the only legal way to stop him. Then we split up as planned, Caleb decided. I'll take the southern settlements where the terrain is rough. You take the north with Tom. It's safer. I can handle myself, Eleanor argued. I know you can, Caleb said, stopping her. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. You are an incredible woman, Eleanor, but I need you safe, because if something happens to you, I don't think I could survive losing a wife twice. Lily, watching from the stairs, smiled. Her papa and Mama Eleanor were fighting, but it felt different now. They were fighting on the same side. Eleanor spent the next 5 days traveling the northern ridge with Tom, the foreman. The journey was grueling, but her determination was harder than the granite beneath her horse's hooves. They rode from homestead to homestead, collecting the dark secrets of Silas Blackwood's empire, the Hendersons forced to sell for pennies, the Millers, charged interest that magically compounded overnight, the grieving widow Johnson, whose daughter was coerced into servitude to pay a phantom debt. Each testimony was a jagged piece of a puzzle, and Eleanor collected them with the precision of a surgeon. Meanwhile, Caleb rode south into the Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon known for rock slides and ambushes. He knew the risks. Blackwood had eyes everywhere, but they needed proof from all corners of the territory to make the charges stick. On the 4th day, the wind died down, leaving an eerie silence in the canyon. Caleb felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He reached for his rifle, but he was too late. The distinct click of a hammer being cocked echoed off the canyon walls. Blackwood sends his regards, a voice sneered from the rocks. The crack of the rifle was deafening. The bullet caught Caleb high in the shoulder, the impact violent enough to throw him clear off his saddle. He hit the dry creek bed hard, the world spinning into a blur of gray and red. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard boots crunching on gravel. 2 men rifled through his saddlebags. Got him, one grunted. The testimonies. Blackwood will be pleased. What about him? The other asked, kicking Caleb's boot. Leave him. If he dies out here, the buzzards will call it an accident. They took his horse, his gun, and his canteen, leaving him bleeding in the dust. Caleb lay there watching clouds drift across a blue square of sky, feeling his life leak out into the thirsty earth. He thought of Sarah, wondering if he would see her soon. But then, another face pushed into his mind. Green eyes, auburn hair, the way she had defended his daughter, the way she had looked in the moonlight in Cheyenne. Not yet, he gritted out, tasting copper. I'm not done yet. He dragged himself to the creek bank, used his shirt to bind the wound, and started to crawl. He made it 3 miles before the darkness finally took him. His horse, a loyal roan, found its way home the next morning. Eleanor, having just returned with her own sheaf of documents, went white when she saw the empty saddle. Tom, get the men! Now! She screamed, her composure shattering. They found him before nightfall, unconscious by the creek, his breathing shallow and ragged. They hauled him back to the ranch house, laying him on the kitchen table because the light was better. Martha was sobbing, but Eleanor went cold and sharp. She opened the leather medical bag. She had insisted on bringing from Philadelphia the bag her father had told her was a waste of space. I need boiling water, clean cloths, whiskey, and laudanum, she ordered, her voice cracking like a whip. Martha, hold the lantern. Tom, hold his legs. The bullet was deep, lodged dangerously close to the collarbone. Eleanor's hands, which had trembled when she tried to bake biscuits, were now steady as stone. This was her world. She had assisted her father in dozens of surgeries, standing in the shadows while he took the credit. Now she was the only thing standing between Caleb and the grave. Stay with me, she whispered as she probed the wound. Don't you dare leave us, Caleb Thorne. It took an hour of agonizing work, but finally, the bullet clattered into a metal bowl. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and stitched the skin with precise, neat strokes. When she finally stepped back, wiping blood from her hands, she found Lily standing in the doorway, pale as a ghost. Will he live? The child asked. Yes, Eleanor said, sinking into a chair. Your papa's too stubborn to die. Eleanor didn't leave his side for 2 days. She monitored his fever, changed his bandages, and forced water between his cracked lips. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Caleb's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused. Eleanor, he croaked. The testimony's gone. They took them. Hush, she soothed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. We failed, he whispered, trying to sit up and groaning. You should have let me die. I lost the ranch. Don't you dare, Eleanor snapped, her eyes filling with sudden tears. Don't you dare say that to me after I just fought the devil to keep you here. Eleanor, listen. No, you listen, she interrupted. When that horse came back without you, I didn't care about the ranch. I didn't care about the debt. I realized that somewhere between Blackwood's threats and your stubbornness, this stopped being a business arrangement. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. I married you for land, he confessed softly, and because I had no choice. I know. But somewhere along the way, he continued, reaching out with his good hand to cup her face, you became the choice I would make anyway. You gave me my daughter back. You gave me a reason to fight. I can't give you children, Caleb, she reminded him, her voice trembling. You gave me a life. That is more than enough. It is everything. He pulled her down, and this time, when they kissed, it wasn't a contract. It was a vow. It was a promise forged in fire and blood. 2 weeks later, a carriage rattled up the driveway. It wasn't Blackwood. It was Samuel Fletcher, accompanied by a grim-faced U.S. Marshal. Caleb, his arm in a sling, stood on the porch with Eleanor and Lily. We heard you had some trouble, Sam said, eyeing Caleb's bandages. Blackwood is in the saloon celebrating his victory. He thinks you're dead or broken. He's wrong, Eleanor said, handing Sam a thick leather satchel. He stole Caleb's testimonies, but he didn't touch mine. 17 sworn affidavits, Sam, plus 1 count of attempted murder. They rode into town together. Silas Blackwood was holding court at the bar, laughing with the very men who had shot Caleb. When the doors swung open, the room went silent. Silas Blackwood, the marshal announced, his voice booming. You are under arrest for fraud, usury, and attempted murder. Blackwood's face turned a violent shade of purple. You can't prove anything? These are lies from a desperate spinster and a broken cowboy. We can prove everything, Eleanor said, stepping forward, her voice ringing clear as a church bell. You underestimated us, Silas. You thought broken things were useless. You forgot that broken glass cuts. As they led Blackwood away in cuffs, the town of Iron Ridge watched in silence. The land baron was fallen, and standing in the street, battered but unbroken, stood the Thorne family, whole. With the shadow of Silas Blackwood finally lifted, winter descended on the Wyoming territory, but for the first time in years, the cold didn't seep into the bones. Of the house at the Jagged Rock, the snow piled high against the log walls. But inside, the hearth roared with a warmth that had nothing to do with firewood. Life settled into a rhythm of peace. Caleb's shoulder healed, leaving a jagged scar that he told. Eleanor was a map of the day he realized he loved her. Eleanor, once the outcast of Philadelphia, became the heart of the homestead. She taught Lily to read, using books ordered from Chicago, and taught her how to stitch wounds as neatly as she stitched embroidery. The barren spinster and the broken cowboy were rebuilding the world they had almost lost. But in late January, as the wind howled like a banshee through the canyon, Eleanor found Caleb in the barn mending a bridle. She looked pale, her hand resting absently on her stomach. Caleb, she said, her voice trembling in a way he hadn't heard since their wedding day. I need to tell you something. He dropped the leather immediately, panic flashing in his eyes. What is it? Is it Blackwood's men? Is it your father? No, she breathed, stepping closer. I've been feeling unwell, tired, nauseated. I thought it was the winter flu, or maybe the stress leaving my body, but I know the signs. I've heard my father's patients describe them 1,000 times. Caleb frowned, confused. You're sick? No, Caleb. She took his rough hands and placed them over her womb. I'm pregnant. The silence in the barn was absolute. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the loft. That's not possible, Caleb stammered, his face draining of color. The doctors in the east? They said. They were wrong, Eleanor whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Or maybe I just needed to be where I belonged before I could bloom. But I am sure, Caleb, I am carrying your child. Fear, sharp and jagged, cut through Caleb's joy. He pulled his hands away. I can't lose you, he choked out. Sarah, childbirth took her. If this kills you, Eleanor, I won't survive it. I can't do this again. Look at me, she commanded, grabbing his face. I am not Sarah, and we are not victims anymore. We will fight for this, just like we fought for the land. Together. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers painting the valley in purple and gold. Eleanor grew heavy with the child, blooming in a way the town gossips said was impossible. In April, Mrs. Schmidt, a formidable midwife from the next valley over, moved into the guest room. "You are small," Mrs. Schmidt grunted, examining Eleanor, "but you have the spirit of a bear. It will be fine." On a stormy night in May, labor began. It was long and grueling. Caleb paced the porch for hours, listening to the wind and the sounds of pain from the bedroom, terrified that history was repeating itself. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years, bargaining everything he owned for her life. Just as dawn broke, a cry pierced the air. "A boy!" Mrs. Schmidt shouted. Caleb rushed to the door, but Mrs. Schmidt held up a hand. "Wait, we are not done." 20 minutes later, a second cry joined the first. Twins. When Caleb was finally allowed into the room, the air smelled of lavender and exhaustion. Eleanor lay against the pillows, pale but radiant, holding 2 bundles. "Meet your children, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice raspy. Caleb fell to his knees beside the bed, weeping openly. "They're perfect." "This is Samuel," Eleanor said, looking at the boy. "After the lawyer who helped save us. And this," she kissed the forehead of the girl. "This is hope, because that is what you gave me when I had none." Lily crept into the room, her eyes wide with wonder. "2?" she gasped. "I have to protect 2? "You'll be the best big sister in the West," Eleanor promised. Pulling Lily into the embrace, news spread through Iron Ridge like wildfire. The Barren woman had given birth to twins. The forced marriage had become a love match. Slowly, the town's judgment turned to respect. Mrs. Higgins brought a quilt she had sewn herself. Mrs. Miller brought jars of peach preserves and an apology. One evening in late summer, Caleb found Eleanor on the porch, rocking the cradle while Lily read aloud nearby. The sun was setting, casting a golden halo over the ranch. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked, leaning against the railing. "Being forced to come here? Leaving your life?" Eleanor looked at the mountains, then at her husband, and finally at the 3 children who made up her heart. "I regret the cruelty that brought us here," she said softly. "But I do not regret the destination. They called me barren, Caleb. They called you broken. They thought they were punishing us by chaining us together." She reached out and took his hand. "They didn't know that sometimes. You have to lose the life you thought you wanted to find the life you were meant to have. This isn't exile, Caleb, it's redemption." Caleb smiled, the shadows of the past finally gone from his eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne." "It's good to be here, cowboy." And there, in the shadow of the mountains, the family that was forged by fire, ink, and choice watched the sun go down, ready to face whatever the frontier threw at them next. Together. And that, my friends, is the legend of the Thorne family, proof that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. If this story touched your heart, or if you just love seeing the underdog win against all odds, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories. It helps us keep the campfire burning and brings more tales of the wild West straight to your screen. I'm curious, what would you have done in Caleb's shoes? Would you have trusted a stranger with your life? Let me know in the comments below. If you're not ready to leave the frontier just yet, check out the playlist on your screen right now for more stories of justice, romance, and survival in the Old West. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Happy trails, everyone!